much to Amazon, to Bloomsbury, the publishers, and particularly Suhel and Abhijit for removing time this Sunday evening. They're usually very busy and obviously they have so many other commitments, but thank you for doing this. And of course, congratulations to the authors, Tuhin Sinha and Prasad, for a brilliant piece of work. But I'm skeptical to still call it a piece of fiction, simply because the world's been hit by a pandemic. And how do you figure out that India is becoming a part of this larger global deep state plot? And how do you cruise now ahead is something that seems more real than fiction. So before I delve into more aspects of this book, I want to bring on Abhijit, because Abhijit, you've read this book in its entirety. And since you are one of India's foremost strategic experts, defense experts, observing international politics and how it plays out, why don't you tell everybody briefly about what you think of this book? What are the key takeaways from this book and how you contextualize it with what is happening in the world right now?
Yeah. Thanks, Shehzad. So, when I started this book, I was like, shit, man, this is so good. And I finished it off in like 2 days flat. Now, the thing was, it forced me to start thinking about how we deal. I mostly deal with nuclear. And when you look at nuclear, you also look at chemical and biological weapons proliferation. And what the book brings out very clearly, in a sense, I mean, even though it's a book of fiction, what it brings out very clearly is, which, I hadn't macro contextualized. You keep hearing about, nuclear weapons proliferation and controlling nuclear weapons, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. After the Syrian chemical attacks in Ghouta, for example, you keep hearing about how the OPCW, the Chemical Weapons Convention, needs to be controlled. Mind you, after this entire episode, nobody is talking about the Biological Weapons Convention. Nobody is talking about the fact that you need to be controlling these weapons. And the most important thing for me that came out in the book that forced a sort of macro introspection was the fact, how do we control it? Because one of the things this book brings out is the near impossibility of attribution of a biological weapons attack. Right, with a nuclear weapon, when it's exploded, you can tell with a great deal of accuracy within 24 hours what chemical traces a particular nuclear explosion has left and therefore which country it came from. With the Ghouta chemical attacks in Syria, you could again tell with all chemical weapons, there are certain chemical traces when you do forensics, where you can tell where this country, which country of origin or which producer this came from. With biological weapons, you don't have that. Right. And this is where the second part of the book comes about so clearly, which is the, the conspiracy surrounding it, the bribery, the financial markets and all of that. I'm a financial dunce. I know economics. I couldn't, if anybody ever made the mistake of giving me their money to invest, I'd probably make them bankrupt quicker than subprime mortgage would in America. So the finance part is a bit over my head. But look at the way this played out in, say, the Lancet. And, the chap who was in charge of, who wrote that letter bullying, the open letter to Lancet bullying all medical opinion that was pinpointing China. How it was silenced at Lancet. The same guy was then picked up by both Facebook and YouTube as their preferred fact checker. This guy was in direct and close contact with both the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and Dr. Dead. Dr. Tedros, we'll call him Dr. Dead for the purposes of this, because he is Dr. Death. So between Dr. Death at the WHO, between the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and the way he was exercising censorship on Facebook and YouTube. Now, I understand why, the authors wouldn't actually put it down to real characters because it gets you into a lot of trouble. But for me, it was just such an accurate summation of that entire catastrophe over 1.5 years that has just ruined so many lives.
Okay, and Suhel, coming to you and taking off from where Abhijit's left it, Do you think that this book is even more relevant because it, in a sense, encapsulates how the deep state has, in a sense, tried to use the pandemic to destabilize democratic governments and replace them with communist ones or communist leaning ones? How do you see this particular book and compare it with what's happening in the real world, simply because you've seen so many regimes closely, democratic and otherwise, you've traveled across the world? How do you see this book in that context?
So let me first congratulate the authors. I mean, all of you know this, and this is Abhijit knows I do about one book a day, and books are my only and endearing passion, enduring as well. A book has three roles in a man or woman's life: information, alignment with ideology, the author's ideology or the thought processes, and influence. What I found remarkable about the book was it was able to engage without thrusting an agenda. When Shakespeare wrote all his political tragedies, he was inspired by Plutarch's lives. So there was a sense of realism and there was also a sense of revolt. He was writing against the regime of Elizabeth I at that point in time. Why this book is remarkable is, even if you read this book 50 years later, say 30 years later, the relevance will remain foremost because human behavior, human frailty, and societal machinations and manipulations will not change. Why this book is even more important and at times incendiary because of its subject is because we've actually gone through. Now, the remarkable thing, and this is a tribute to both these guys, the remarkable thing is when a book straddles contemporary and yet has a historical perspective wrapped in what you and I would term fiction. When fiction actually begins to speak to you or leap at you through the prism of reality, you have a winning combination. So that's what the book achieves, number one. Number two, as Abhijit said, see, a deep state and, democratic, as you also very rightly mentioned, that did it lead to toppling of regimes? No. What it did was the first step of any governmental change or regime is the fallback to national identity. A lot of people, color national identity saying, oh, it's right wing or it's left wing or it's this or it's that. Number two, conspiracy theorists then become the most popular people. Number three, as you rightly said, facts become a casualty. Now, what is remarkable about the book is everything that the book discusses in its contextual environment is true. We have gone through a pandemic. There has been the issue of secrecy around Wuhan. There has been a narrative that has been created across the world, a narrative which moved from Rahul Gandhi saying Modi's vaccine to Akhilesh Yadav saying please don't get vaccinated, to Trump saying consume poison if you have to, you just bloody or Benadryl or whatever the hell he said. So the point I'm making is why this book is interesting is it is relevant, it is riveting, and it rewards the historical context that you're part of. It's very interesting, Shehzad, when you mentioned this, and I will say this as the oldest person in this group.
Youngest at heart.
Youngest at heart, for sure. Books per se, if they embrace you intellectually, it's one thing. If they embrace you emotionally and intellectually, it's better. But the gold standard is when you become part of the narrative. The interesting thing is, as things have turned out, as events have turned out, we are all now part of that book. We are part of the narrative. In some form or the other, our lives have been colored. In some form or the other, our lives have been impacted. In some form or the other, we live under regimes, which some people might call democratic, others might call dictatorial. So that's where I think the book scores remarkably well and will continue to do well. I mean, Amazon has done a very wise thing by sponsoring not just this chat, but by making sure it's on Amazon. Just make sure you don't discount it. Intellect must never be discounted.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The book is available on Amazon India, as you can see in the bottom ticker. But let me take this to the authors. Tuhin, before I come to you, Clark, Suraj. Tuhin, tell us the origins of this book. How did you think of this? How did you all conceptualize that this is the subject you want to write upon? And when you started writing upon this or dwelling upon this, how did you foresee and what kind of research work did you do?
First of all, Shehzad, let me thank you, Abhijit and Suhel for taking time out on this Sunday evening. But I'm equally thankful to the brilliant insights which you as a reader, Abhijit and Suhel, have provided, because I've always believed that, often to readers, some of the insights they provide, it actually provides a new learning experience for the writers, which we probably did not think at the time of writing. So when we embarked upon this journey, Suraj and I, the one line thought that I had in my mind was that we got to write a book which is a very contemporary India under siege story. Because honestly, India has been under siege from the time we became independent. And at the crux of it, even though eventually in the final product that does not have much of a mention, at the crux of this India under siege feel or the threat is a demography war which is taking place every minute, every every day, every month, every year, and which has actually led to a point where, a lot of things have gone out of hand. Now, while we were approaching this book, in fact, I think 40% of the book was done. That is when this pandemic broke out, and we realized we can, take it to another level altogether. The pandemic today, everybody acknowledges it as biowarfare, but the book goes a step beyond that. It is about how the deep state in the US and India, and when I say the deep state, yes, Andolan Jeevis are a very important component of it, because you see them mushrooming post the epidemic, not that they did not exist before that. So how the deep state has actually exploited and manipulated the pandemic across the world, more specifically in, let's say 4 or 5 robust democracies of the world, to alter the political narratives, to attempt regime changes, to attempt, altering political narratives, and how a set of dedicated Indians spanning across professions, and a young economist, a raw agent, a young rookie politician who has had an army background, how they get together to thwart this threat. That's a book. That's what the book is, what the book is about. And I have to compliment Clark. He has an eye for history. Because to be able to connect it with the previous pandemic, which the book very astutely does in a couple of places. I think that was a remarkable feat.
Let me bring in Clark at this point. Before I do, let me just read out what Maruf Raza, somebody who's extremely well known, appears on television with Abhijit and Suhel often, says about this book, the go-to novel to decode China's unrestricted warfare. And then we also have General Syed Atta Hassan. His blurb is also right here on the cover, front cover, a rare geopolitical espionage thriller set in pandemic. Now, my question to you, Clark, is that you in this book, the two of you speak about futuristic warfare. What is this futuristic warfare? What is this CBDC, the gold-backed currency that you're talking about? There's a lot of talking about global capital being moved around and investments being made to control the narrative. So can you explain a bit of that?
Sure. First, thank you, Shehzad, Abhijit, and Suhel for joining us and sharing your wisdom out here. And we see the t-shirt I'm wearing, follow the white rabbit. So we have to find our direction mode, and in terms of knowing where to go. And the war, before the war is for land. Now the war is for the mind. It's about controlling the narrative, controlling the mind. You control the mind, you control the subconscious, then you control the decision making. Without knowing, our subconscious has been controlled. So, historically, culturally, any civilization gets strong militarily. Then they have economic prosperity also happens also, and then culture comes in. When these three levers are not in balance, civilization falls away. And we have seen whether Greek civilization, Roman civilization, even Mughals or Empire, in anyone, it goes away. So how do we control the future? By controlling the masses. And how do you control the masses? By controlling narratives, controlling the mindset and all. And if you can control the money, the debt, the money, you control the people in chains. Because if you have an EMI to pay, if you have a loan, no one is going to raise a voice. Everyone is going to keep quiet. Kaam karna hai, just have to work and forget everything. A free mind can do wonders, but if you're in chains of in terms of money or something, you're gone. Now, US as a reserve currency is there. Since after World War II, the Bretton Woods Conference, the world used the US dollar as a reserve currency. Now, at 15 August 1991, broke the link between the US dollar and the gold, because people are demanding back gold. Because that time, if I gave $1, equivalent amount of gold should come, the governments could ask. Now, that was 15 August 1971. That is the time I would say US lost its financial responsibility to maintain a balance. And 15 August 2021, 50 years, golden jubilee period. What happened? Kabul happened. And as a result, what happens? The face for democracy and freedom goes away. So finance control is the one which it's about financial control. Now, what if China gets everyone is a RMB? What if they say that we have 20,000 tons of gold, we'll link our currency of gold, we'll give it the stability to the world. US dollar could not. Because if you go through economics, you'll see Russia, China, many countries have lowered the US treasuries. Even our RBI has done the same. And RBI has actually bought a lot of gold. So CBDC is the way of central bank digital currency, is the way to match cryptocurrency. But basically taking the currency to the phone, and then so in a way one can, cash will go out of the system and all. So it's about control of the money supply in a way, and then you control the people's voice, and then you don't need companies, just control what people behave. So
okay, that's an interesting aspect. Suhel, coming to you, the book speaks about US and India being close allies, and if you read the book, there is a character that resembles the Indian Prime Minister. There's a character that resembles Donald Trump. Now, of course, I'm not going to reveal what happens in the book, but Suhel, your favorite topic, in reality, which is more stranger than fiction, with Joe Biden taking over the presidency and people going, "We did it, Joe." How does that affect India and US's relationship and the global challenges that India has to navigate across the world and in its neighborhood with a Joe Biden presidency?
So let's go back into Indo-US relations and the historical context. Democrats should have been our natural allies, but it's always the Republicans who do more for India when they are presidents. Obama came on 2 trips. Clinton loved the food at Bukhara, but it was George W. Bush who signed the Indo-US nuclear deal. So there's a historical context to how the Republicans have always warmed up to the idea of India, because they've been more capitalism and capitalist oriented. They're not ideologically aligned, because there is no ideology that America follows other than the what we call the Benjamin. Number 2, I think India's relationship with the United States is president neutral or president agnostic. It really doesn't matter who the president is, because there are 2 things that are at play. Number 1 is the power that we have or supposedly have in the region. So, how we are the dominant power in this region, in the subcontinent. And number 2 is the actual pressure when required, the Indian diaspora within the US exerts and exudes. 3 or 4 days ago, there was a newspaper report to say that the Indian diaspora is the wealthiest and the most influential amongst all ethnic diasporas in the United States. Now, forget Kamala Harris, who's an absolute disaster. Biden, to my mind, is nothing but an establishment stooge. He's always been a Washington guy, the same person or the same a character that the Trumps of the world denounce, saying that these people are so wedded to Washington that their worldview is both limited and extremely self-serving. I believe that two things have happened, and it's interesting that Tuhin and Clark are here. And obviously, Abhijit is the expert on this, but the point I'm making is that India needs to recognize that beyond a point, America is no one's friend, and neither should it be expected to be. America is a self-serving nation, which is primarily in the business of making money. Now, Abhijit mentioned about economics, and where he said that, his forte is not economics. Let me give you a small example, and I want Clark and Tuhin to come in on this. If you ask the elite or the wealthy, the so-called wealthy, middle class above in India, everyone will have $10, $20, $30, which they save when they come back from a trip.
That's true.
$2.3 trillion is claimed to have been spent in Afghanistan. They're saying about 2, 3, 4 billion would be in currency. India is not exactly one of the wealthiest countries in the world. Take that example of what I've said of residual dollar currency available, and now amplified by the number of countries that are dotting the world, whether it's the continent of Africa and the countries therein, blah, blah, blah. You will see that at least about $1 trillion to $2 trillion currency value is outside the United States, which never comes back into the US system. Right. So when people say, oh my God, the US has spent so much money, will it have an inflationary impact? No. 2/3 of the treasury bonds is today owned by China. Has it had any impact? Could Trump have taken that risk if that impact would have been felt domestically? No. So we are looking at an economic powerhouse that has always created self-insulation. It has been insulated from the vagaries of what I call economic disruption across the world. What happened in 2008? They just printed more currency. You had TARP. Right. What did Paulson do? His advice to George W. Bush was, we'll print more money. We'll do TARP and let everyone collapse, and then we'll see. So, if to answer your question in a more specific way, therefore, is that yes, economic compulsions often drive nations to do the things they do. Everyone says Bin Laden attacked New York, blah, 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 to send the world a message. No. He hurt America where it hit it the most. He hurt them in the economic domain. The symbolism of the World Trade Center towers 1 and 2 collapsing was to bring about an economic dent, which he did. If you remember, US airspace was closed. Billions of dollars were spent on security within the United States. But then the United States, being the United States, used their own security companies, whether it's Halliburton, Westinghouse, name it. I mean, Abhijit would know the list, to basically recover. So my point is that Indo-US relations will always remain impervious to any dramatic occupants of the White House. But we have to recognize that Republicans are far kinder, far more compassionate, and more empathetic of India than the Democrats have been. And the list is endless. Jimmy Carter, he said, oh, my mother served in India, worked with Mother Teresa. Ghenta, did nothing for India. Obama, nothing for India. Bill Clinton, nothing for India.
They're good at photo.
Yeah. So that's how it
Abhijit,
is.
you want to weigh in on this before I get the authors back onto another aspect that's troubling the neighborhood?
Yeah, just two things. Just first to add on to what Suhel ended with, it's not just that the Democrats don't do anything for India. It's also the fact that the Indian inferiority complex is so much that we celebrate the presidents who don't do anything for India, and we're completely ungrateful to the presidents who do things for India. Right? Everybody goes bonkers over Kennedy, over Clinton, and they forget completely the role that Clinton played during Kargil or during the nuclear blasts and things like that. He actually, the letter that Vajpayee ji sent him, saying, it was China that necessitated it, he leaked it and he gave it to the Chinese. And we still have, HT Leadership Summit and whatnot, gobbledygook calling him as a thought leader and whatnot. Tony Blair, A-grade war criminal who set the foundation for Labour to become the anti-India thing that it is in Britain, you call them as global leaders. Boris Johnson will never be called. George W. Bush will never be called. Trump will never be called. So, this is something that plays. The second thing which I wanted to bring up specifically was, it's quite painful that even though you've read it, you're not allowed to sort of quote from it because you don't want to destroy the book for the other readers. But the one
no
of the
spoilers.
things that exactly, which is why I'm going to talk about the macro. What this book does, even though it is micro-fiction, great micro-detail, it forces you to think in the macro, which is very, very important. So now that Tuhin has revealed that Clark was the one behind the historical parallels and things, that going back to the last pandemic, but why the last pandemic? Even if you look at the previous big pandemic, the Black Death in Europe, look at the amount of social change it created. The scientific revolution, the Renaissance, the Protestant split, and all of that came about because of that. So even the last pandemic, the flu, the great influenza pandemic, it set a lot of things in motion, which we experience today. I'm very curious. I think the next part of the book, and I think there should be a part 2 to this, should really get into a speculative fiction set in the future on what the knockdown effects will actually be.
No, the part 2 can also be, and on this I want to join the authors. The part 2 can also be on what's happening around our neighborhood, particularly with the rise of the Taliban or the return of the Taliban. Some are calling it the good Taliban, the Taliban 2.0. But having said that, China has been extremely quick, Tuhin, in establishing diplomatic relations with Taliban, and they in a sense are legitimizing the Taliban. Now, if you were to write a sequel on that, or if you want to draw some of the aspects that you've discussed in the book and relate it to those that you're seeing happen in Afghanistan, what would be the context of the Chinese immediately, in a sense, embracing the Taliban faster than liberals in our country have done?
Well, we actually wanted to do a series, a second part on Mission Balochistan, on how India manages to free Balochistan. Because ideally, if you ask me, after the blunder which Nehru committed of not accepting the UNSC seat way back in 1950-51, Abhijit, if I'm right. In fact, the book also reproduces a letter which, in toto, which Sardar Patel had written to Nehru in 1949, warning him against the ways of China. So, at this point of time, China legitimizing Taliban is it's not something unexpected. China, after the COVID manufactured bio warfare, I think the devilish intent of China is very open, and they would not think twice before embracing all that is in their interest, or they won't desist from exploiting the most evil means to be in power. But yes, India, in terms of India, the kind of neighbor, India's geography puts it in a great peril. But thankfully, we have a strong leadership. In fact, I think I would be more concerned about the impact of Taliban takeover internally, because as you say, you've witnessed some voices already. Obviously, parts of Samajwadi Party, parts of possibly TMC embracing the Taliban or speaking good about Taliban. So I would be more concerned about the fallout of the Taliban takeover internally. It only one needs to fortify our security interests. So yes, the application of Article 370 and 35A, I would say, was a very visionary step now. Because for all you know, you've seen the reaction of Mehbooba Mufti also post that.
Clark, why don't you weigh in on what is happening in Afghanistan and in the context of what you all have foreseen in this book with the kind of role China is playing? What is it that you foresee China doing in Afghanistan, and how does it impact India?
Yeah, so the Chinese game is a psychological warfare, the 3 warfare strategy. And they don't look 1 year, 2 year, 10 years, 20 years down the plan. There is a white paper out there for everyone to read. 2049 China 100 years takeover of the Chinese Communist Party in terms of taking over the China and the in 1949 they took over China, and 2049 is 100 years. So in that 100 years they want to be dominant militarily, economically, culturally. So and sports, probably Olympics and all the stuff happen. So it is really funny that China was first to legitimize this when they themselves are sort of probably at the same level of human rights, I would say, in a way, as the Taliban's. But the point, some it's about the money, and all. And in the end, I do agree with Suhel that India has to be independent and work on its own, because we have to be strong ourselves. Otherwise, things will not go well. And the danger is clear and present. And so every Indian citizen to actually be aware of geopolitics right now, because this is about the future of the children. It is about the future of the civilization. Because if we are not aware, then it can be sort of, I won't say slavery, but we'll go in a way that our voices will be as we want it to be. And it's sad sometimes because our own internal citizenry voices are drowned in the other people's voices, as Tali liberals has just called it. Because that's the first time hearing that word, but it happens that way. And Abhijit is right. Pandemic does create a different change in history. This is definitely going to create a change in history. It's up to us. How do we define the history and all? Because China is here. They're not going anywhere. Even after the Nazis fell down, Operation Paperclip, you have the scientists going to Soviet Union and US, and things just remain the same. So it is us to be strong ourselves. So the threat is clear. It's clear and present danger, and we have to make us economical strong and militarily strong.
Let me take this to Suhel. Suhel, what do you make of the bunch of people who I call Taliban? It's a word being used popularly on social media, of in a sense normalizing, mainstreaming, in a sense legitimizing the Taliban as if there is something good about them, and also this distinction being made between the Taliban being good, the IS Khorasan being worse than the Taliban, and therefore that being bad. What do you make of this? Is this part of what the authors visualize in this book, where certain people in the country itself are actually playing part and parcel in actually creating that narrative, or do you think that it's pragmatic to do what they're doing?
I completely decry this nonsense that I've been seeing. The Taliban version 1.0, version 2.0, version 21.0, the scoundrels will be the same. They'll be self-serving barbarians, murderers, nothing more, nothing less. To give them this benefit of doubt, because you want to show yourself as true liberals. By the way, I want to now bust this whole liberal nonsense of this country. Who are the bloody liberals to say they're liberal? How do you define a liberal? I'm liberal, but do I need to wear a badge? A, B, how do I define nationalism? Do I need to wave the Tiranga every day to say I'm a nationalist? No. The point is, the BJP here, and I have to say with due respect to Tuhin's alliances there, the BJP allows these guys to get away because their response is not to counter-argue, but to say, oh, but then you're anti-national. You're playing into their hands. You should ignore these fellows or call them out or, call their bluff. How can you condone Taliban under the veneer of human rights? Which is why I said on an earlier program, which Abhijit and I were both on, saying that Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International's silence is telling. It is telling because human rights violations didn't happen when the Americans left. They were happening when the Americans arrived. And then it continued thereafter. The point I'm making is you don't go into bed with an elephant. You never know when the elephant turns over and the pleasure turns into pain. So even the negotiation with the Taliban is a sign to my mind of foreign policy weakness. The day we negotiate with them, we will do two things. Number one, we will recognize them. And number two, we can't ever get out of a situation because the spider and the butterfly engagement has already happened. So what do we need to do? we need to recognize that engaging with the Taliban is like getting into a pig fight. You get dirty, the pig enjoys it. Number two, you're legitimizing a brutal regime which cares about nothing, but which is completely in bed and has consummated that relationship with Pakistan. Number three, they are building an alliance of trouble. They are building an alliance of destruction. And exactly what the book mentions. The deep state has the ability to create narratives which are not only false, but which are endearing to a so-called evolved mind. But then is that mind truly evolved? Would you condone the barbarism of a Taliban under the veneer of liberal thinking? You wouldn't. Would you give the benefit of doubt to people who have, within day 5 of taking over, said that we will not have co-education in our schools, that women will not report to work to hospitals, which they then altered? But that's who they are. They dragged a folk singer out and killed him brutally.
Yeah,
that's who these people are. They are destroyers of culture. They are destroyers of value. They are destroyers of human endeavor. Why do so many Afghans want to leave Afghanistan? Don't they love their motherland? Yes, but they love their lives more. Their lives are in danger. So that's the reality.
And sometimes I think that.
Yeah.
So I just want to add this point. Just came in my head. Sometimes I think that.
Go ahead.
They say that we don't like anything. Now you're using the guns. It's hypocrisy everywhere. So, and legitimizing them it'll be a fall of a democratic stand. It'll be a very sad day if we actually do that. But we'll have to see how things turn out. So yeah.
So
speaking of hypocrisy. Speaking of hypocrisy, Tuhin and Abhijit, I want to draw you in on this part of the hypocrisy as well. There's a reference to the anti-CA protesters, Tuhin, whom you have described as Andolan Jivis, the two of y'all, in your book. And you all have...
the Honorable Prime Minister did that. We've only taken the word for it.
Yes, so you borrowed from that terminology, and you have conceived them as part of these deep state actors who are trying to shape the narrative. But there is a hypocrisy that's visible there too, right? Because as we saw those Sikhs coming in, Abhijit, as we saw those Hindus coming in on Indian plains, you had a bunch of people saying that that's great, now extend the CA, or in a sense actually endorsing the CA. So Tuhin, starting with you and then going to Abhijit, this is yet another hypocrisy that's been busted.
You know, Shehzad, my worry is that world over, there is an increasing alliance or increasing getting together of liberals/communists and Islamists. This nexus is very difficult to understand. But, you know, in fact, to take Suhel's point ahead, in fact, all of the Democrat presidents of the US have been most pro-Pakistan presidents. So, you know, this entire thing about liberal/communist Islamist nexus, which is engulfing the world, I think it's something which is very worrisome. So they oppose strong right-wing regimes for the heck of it. They haven't read the farm laws, they haven't read the CAA, but then their target is the one man who, you know, who's bringing these laws. So I think that, you know, it really, national security, of course, is something which is an alien concept to them. They don't believe in a nation state any which way. That is where the problem, most of their problems emanate from.
Abhijit. I think you're on mute.
You're on mute.
Sorry. So tell me a human being who isn't a hypocrite, right? I mean, to be a human is to be a hypocrite. The moment you have critical thinking, you tend to have certain internal contradictions that make you a hypocrite. My thing always is, and you know, this kind of plays completely into that, the financial markets conspiracy part of the book as well, is the fact that, you know, this whole left tends to be global while the right tends to be localized. So it's very easy to co-opt because the right lives in the country, in local norms, in local customs and things like that. The left kind of has a global standard, right? There are certain set measures that they all apply to. And so what happens is when you're looking at institutions like the deep state, They look for continuity when they grow international. And that's very important, because with the right, you will never have that institutional handover of memory. You will not have that globalism that the left has in that sense. So, when the Prime Minister says Andolan Jivi, there is a great incentivization of this kind of thing with money provided by very similar actors. Isn't it curious that, say, somebody like George Soros, who goes on and on and on against authoritarians, okay, who just now wrote a piece calling Xi Jinping the biggest threat to world peace or something, he was pretty much on the same side as Xi Jinping for most of the COVID crisis. Everything that these clowns were doing, from censoring mentions of China, censoring mentions of the Wuhan lab of virology, censoring mentions of China's command responsibility in getting this out, was they're all beneficiaries of George Soros funding. So it's that whole thing that, there is this sort of international, intersectional Andolan Jivi, who on one hand will have their sort of fake fights in public, but in private, they operate together. Now, this is kind of where I disagree with Suraj and Tuhin, because in my experience, the deep state isn't this kind of one brain. It's actually a lot of extremely duplicitous people who find common interests to work in, who have an equivalent level of low scruples, that they find how they can work together even when attacking each other. And the second part of it is, to be a leftist, unless you control things, you have to be very dumb. Like if you were in the Soviet Communist Party, other than being Lenin or Stalin or Trotsky or somebody like that, you fundamentally had to have a very low IQ. You either had to be under 30 or have a very low IQ. Over 30, your IQ, for most men at least, it tends to increase exponentially. So the rest of them are essentially these sort of sheep, mindless sheep. And it takes you back sort of to that 1984 thing, that those droves coming out with their minds pre-programmed and conditioned. And that is where this whole mind control. See, what is described in 1984 is very different from what is described in Mission Shengzhan, but they're very similar in that sense, right? Because 1984 is direct brainwashing. It's a very crude kind of brainwashing, whereas what this book shows you is there's a very sophisticated kind of brainwashing that can happen. There is a very sophisticated kind of narrative control that can happen, right? There's an incentivized narrative control that can happen, and that's really important.
So we're going to take a couple of questions from the audience, and then we're going to close this very, very engaging conversation. Tuhin and Clark, this is a question that's coming out to you all from Swati. She asks, it's one thing to write a non-fiction book together. That's an easier task, I believe. Although I haven't written any books, but how do two people write a book on fiction together?
So I give the credit to Suresh for the actual writing. I have been involved with the conceptualization of the characters, the story graph, the broader chapter outlines, the chunks, and adding my 2 cents, correcting things. But I think most of the writing has been done by Suraj, and hats off to him. It's a like I said, most of the book has been written during the lockdown, so it's a lockdown book.
So Tuhin and Suraj were like the Modi and Amit Shah of this book. Is that the right analogy?
That's being really rich and extending your tenure as spokesperson beyond any reasonable doubt, because to attribute intellectual
I can also use Vajpayee and Advani. I mean, I have got all my jugalbandis happening. But Suraj, you want to weigh in on that before I go to Suhel? There's a question for Suhel as well. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you, Tuhin, for your kind words. And it was a very interesting 2019 when the first Facebook chat came up that would you like to connect? I've got something interesting. We started talking on the phone and all. And this whole theme of India under attack, because it's not a physical attack, it's an attack of emotions, attack of many things. So that's how we started looking into making the thing that what's the biggest threat. We identified few threats. Okay, we said this threat will take for the first book, and we have the second book, third book, and all. And that's how it happened. And he gave me a free hand. I brought in past history, the presents. I wanted to bring more things. I wanted to go to the Roman times also, but the book would have been too long. So I cut myself in, and because history is always interesting to me. Yeah.
We can look forward to prequels and sequels. But Suhel, coming to you, the question is that has China been able to use this pandemic to actually establish itself in a sense in a position of dominance across the world and snatch away that position from the United States?
I don't think so, because what China lacks, what it makes up in economic heft, it lacks in respect. People are wary of investing in China, but it's like a fait accompli. You have to invest in China, but it's not a place that draws you either through affection or robust investment. But here's what's happened, and this is interesting. The only economy of the world in the world that has jumped many times over is the Chinese economy. So China has recovered much to the detriment of all of us in a remarkable way. The secrecy with which China functions and the lack of transparency, it cocks a snook at every global norm of transparency, and yet no one, criticizes China. I mean, criticizing China is like, the holy grail. So there are issues with China, and I think China has the same level of economic influence it had pre-pandemic. It has further slipped in terms of respect, but it doesn't care because, it's not bothered about public opinion. And I think as we go forward, the fact that governments want to investigate China will also result in nothing. I mean, for all the bravado of Trump and Biden and before that Obama, there was very little that they could do to China. Because China literally has them by the you-know-what. And because America as a market, again, is highly dependent on China, both for trade and in manufacturing of components, you have a situation where you just can't take them on. And also look at every process that the Chinese indulge in, whether it's geopolitical, whether it is economic, it's almost as if they don't give a damn. They're the only country that creates ghettos of Chinese labor and Chinese workers wherever they enter. For all the nonsense that Anand Sharma of the Congress used to spout, saying, oh, I know Mandela, I know this, I know that. 11 or 14 years ago, The Economist did a brilliant article, and they said that watch how China overtakes all other countries in the African subcontinent. You're talking about lithium today. China is huge in lithium. With that, they will get into EVs and controlling EV businesses. Data analytics, huge. So it's not going to go away in a hurry. I mean, you may curse them, but you can't live without them.
But can't live without them. Abhijit, final words on whether China should be held accountable for its actions, particularly the pandemic.
You're on mute. You're on mute.
Sorry, yeah. So China should be held accountable. The question is, how are you going to hold it accountable? Right? You're so interlinked with it. If you impose economic sanctions, you'll end up hurting yourself in the short term. I remember in late 2020, both Macron and Trump had wanted a sort of disengagement and disentanglement of China. That simply wasn't about to happen. And today, neither Macron and, of course, Trump has been censored, so we don't know what he's thinking or saying at the moment. But Macron certainly isn't talking about detangling manufacturing from China anymore. So this is number one. Militarily, what are you going to do to China? In terms of diplomacy, what can you do to China? And finally, in terms of local public validation, given that China controls or funds most businesses, most outlets, to the point that a New York Times or Washington Post would be far more critical of India than they ever will be of China, how exactly are you going to get your own people on board when most of the Democratic Party itself would be compromised in terms of business linkages with China? Forget your public. How are you even going to get your own party on board on any kind of action against China? So it's really not going to happen. I think there is a case to be made here that once you've purchased so much, your integrity to act doesn't exist. So you won't act and you'll pass off a necessity as a virtue.
On that note, I think there are a lot of ideas couched in there for many sequels, but I want to hand it over to Deepak and request them that all the other sequels should be efficiently marketed and published by Bloomsbury and by Amazon. But Deepak, I hand it over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Shehzad. To our panel, thank you for the great session and sharing your experiences.
Let me take this opportunity to thank everybody, Shehzad, Suhel, Abhijit. It's been such an honor to have you all on this session.
Thank you.
Especially for insights, because I'm a man of many parts, so I just I'm a generalist. I have never specialized the way you guys are into your domains. So it's lovely hearing you out, and Shehzad, I think that the questions, the way the entire session flowed was absolutely fantabulous. Thanks, Suraj. Thank you, Deepak, for all the technical support.
Yeah. Thank you, Tuhin. Thank you for the great session and sharing your experiences and thoughts with us. And everyone who is watching us, thank you for tuning in on Sunday evening. You can check out Mission Shengzhan by Tuhin Sinha and Clark Prasad on Amazon India's website and app. Happy reading, India.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.